My name is Amelia Carley, and I'm a visual artist living and working in Brooklyn, New York. I'm originally from Colorado, and I was really lucky to have super supportive parents growing up. So my background in art started at a really young age where I loved drawing and painting from as early as I can remember. And then I pursued art in my undergraduate and graduate studies, attending the School of the Arts in Chicago, University of Colorado at Boulder, and then doing my Master's of Fine Arts at Georgia State University in Atlanta. And my work is heavily informed by my upbringing in Colorado, particularly the Western landscapes that I experienced as a child. My family was relatively big. There were 4 kids, and we didn't have a ton of money to take lavish vacations. So my parents' love of the outdoors and their enjoyment of like camping and backpacking, we would all load up in the car and take these epic road trips every summer, predominantly to national parks in the American Southwest. And oftentimes these were really gorgeous desert landscapes, like in Utah around Moab, and then southern Colorado, Four Corners area. And these parks just were mind-blowing as a child, like the expanse and the desert landscapes and the beautiful rock formations. And I feel like those early childhood experiences of seeing these fantastical landscapes are still really influencing my work today. My biggest influences for my work are honestly my artist friends who are making work in a similar vein to mine. Both friends who make work that is in line with my work. I find a lot of inspiration from having studio visits with these people and having good conversations with them, and also watching their work evolve over time. Some artists who I really admire, whose work is really inspiring to me, are Debbie Keynote, Jen Hitchens, and Johnny Tremblay. They're artists making work about landscape with a lot of beautiful color and mark making influences that I just absolutely love as friends and contemporaries. There are definitely a lot of historical artists that have influenced me over the years, sometimes in their conceptual thoughts, sometimes in their technique. But someone who holds a special spot in my heart is actually Georgia O'Keeffe. Like I mentioned, not a lot of family members of mine were directly involved in the arts, but I did have an aunt who passed recently, who lived in Santa Fe, and she was always really creative and had beautiful creative energy. And whenever we'd go visit her and I had this special bond for our love of art making. And I have these beautiful memories of going to the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum with her and just falling in love with her oil paintings and her love of the desert, which I also share. So I think that as a historical reference, definitely someone who I can't stop thinking about in my life. Also, Baudrillard, the philosopher, wrote this book called America, and there are some fantastic sections about the desert and the American West, and I think those thoughts really have stayed and influenced my work over time. In my studio right now, I'm focusing on oil paintings, which have kind of been my favorite for some time. I work in other media as well. In the past, I've done some installations and worked sculpturally. I've even experimented with some printmaking, and I love all sort of painting materials. I work in watercolor a fair amount, occasionally in acrylic, but oil painting has really been my favorite material for a long time. The current work that I'm making is actually based on sculptural models. So the work derived from my interest in landscape, as I mentioned. I learned about this rehabilitated landfill from my painter friend Ben Cowan. When I first moved to New York, it's this place called Glass Bottle Beach in Dead Horse Bay, and it's right on the south, like sort of further southeast corner of Brooklyn, right at the border of Queens. And this used to be a giant landfill, and it has been rehabilitated into an open space now, but there's this section of beach where glass continuously washes up on the shore from the landfill and then just from the waterway. And it's a really beautiful and bizarre sort of remnant of this landfill. So he mentioned this to me because he knew I was making work about sand and glass and constructing these miniature dioramas using this material and then using those as painting reference. So I took this trip out to this beach, collected glass remnants from this old landfill, and constructed these mountainous forms using the glass. And then from there I light them, sort of thinking about time of day or other really beautiful color experiences that happen within nature, and then photograph these miniature diorama-like landscapes that I've created. And then those are used for painting reference. So the images are translated into paintings from the sculptural forms. So that's kind of the work I'm making right now. The most recent iteration of that work has incorporated these portal-like shapes, as my work very much relates to my own experience in nature and my memories of these trips I took as a kid. I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between memory and landscape, as well as memory and dreams. And so these portals in my mind are the fusion of time and space. So two experiences or multiple experiences of a particular landscape throughout one's experience, whether that's visiting it in person or visiting it in your memory or your dreams. So thinking about the fusion of these memories of a place, whether lived or imagined, that are being fused together through these portals that are intuitively cut between two images and then rendered on the canvas. One of the biggest challenges of being an artist would be, I think, balancing just having a good work-life balance, I guess. As someone who doesn't have a ton of financial support from family members, I know some artists come from a situation where they have a lot of flexibility to work in their studio. I have to have a job right now, which I know a lot of artists do and a lot of artists don't talk about, but I also teach, which I think is a really fulfilling way to have a steady income as an artist. And so I teach mostly color classes, like color theory, design classes. I think just making sure to have that balance of the ebb and flow of relying on your artwork as a source of income, which can be really complicated, and it can complicate your relationship with your creative practice, and knowing what to make and how to make it, and being influenced by the financial drive can be really tricky. So having the stability of regular income from another creative outlet at teaching has been really helpful for me to stay focused on the work that I want to make and pursue. Related to that, if I were to give advice to my younger self, it would really be to take time to feel confident in the ideas that you are putting forth within your artwork. Truly, I think work that is reflective of your lived experience in some way, something that is close to what you truly know and want to share with the world. So it's hard as a young artist to know what that looks like. We don't always know ourselves very well when we're young. Some people find that out really early and dive into something they're passionate about. But some of us take a little time and a windier road to get to that point where you feel like the work you're making is a really good reflection of your lived experience or something you're truly passionate about. So I think just being thoughtful about what you're putting out in the world and feeling like that is a honest and genuine reflection of your knowledge of yourself. So whatever that looks like for you. I have tried a few unconventional mediums in my time. I've, like I mentioned before, played with sculpture installation, tried a bunch of different painting techniques. I've even worked with ceramics a fair amount, not necessarily directly related to this body of work, but like I loved, throwing pots on the wheel when I was younger, and still get to play with clay every once in a while. I think working with different materials and being playful in a new material can be really informative and helpful to grow how you express whatever your artwork is about. So I've really enjoyed exploring new materials and experimenting, though. I do really love painting at my core, so I do typically come back to making paintings, but I think it's healthy and productive to try new materials and techniques. When I'm working in the studio, I do listen to music, and more commonly actually podcasts or audio content. So audiobooks for sure. I love a mixture of fiction, nonfiction. Same with podcasts. I will listen to some true crime, some like more fantastical, like weird audio drama stuff, a mixture of like indie music. I kind of mix it up. Studio days can be long, and if you're making a big painting that takes a lot of time, sometimes it's nice to change up the audio routine. So I have a whole mixture of things that I listen to. I typically don't like to work in silence. I like to have something on. I like this question about someone's reaction to your work. I would say the best reaction that I've ever had to my work is actually from quite a while ago. Before I was making this current body of work, I was making these pieces about historical experiences within landscape, very much related to my youth as, going to visit national parks. I was thinking a lot about the signage that exists in those spaces when you're experiencing a natural, phenomenon of landscape, how there's often park signage that's telling you about how or what you should be thinking about or experiencing in that landscape. So for a period of time, I was making these, what I called false historical narratives. So I would create physical wooden signs that were mimicking the signage that I had seen like in places like Yellowstone. And instead of talking about actual history, I would write essentially historical fiction. So I do a lot of research, and I would write historical fiction around a particular landscape that I was engaged with for the piece. So this story comes from this time that I was invited to a group show in a mountainside and outside of Boulder, Colorado. It was called Dream Canyon. And I created this story about miners who had gotten lost on the canyon, in this canyon on this ledge, and that Ute Indians, like ghosts essentially, had haunted them to the point of essentially like walking them off this cliff. So it's a dark story, but there's a very fraught history with the native people in the area and the Utes who were occupying that space with the miners. And so I wanted to kind of talk about the history, and so this idea of these miners falling to their death on this cliff edge as you're reading this sign, as they were hunted and like traveling in the snow, and how these visions of Utes had like caused them to perish. So I wrote this narrative and I put it on a sign, and I planted it in the landscape, and I had done it for sort of a experience of a performance that people were going to actually view it, but then I decided to just leave it there. I was going to come back and retrieve it. I left it for about a month, just as an experiment. And when I came to retrieve it, I wanted to document how it had evolved in the landscape. I wasn't sure how many people had seen it, but I ended up exhibiting the plaque along with images of its original installation and an image of the canyon that it would sit in front of in a gallery. And at the opening of this show, I had someone come up to me and we started talking about the piece, and they said, "Oh, I heard about this." And I was curious. I was like, "What do you mean you've heard about this artwork before that I made?" And the person was like, no, I know about this story. And they proceeded to tell me about the narrative that I had written on this plaque that's in front of them, and telling me about this history. And they were absolutely convinced that it was real. And so what I ended up figuring out was that enough people had come and read this information on this sign that the story had been told word of mouth through the community, the small community, and this person had heard this story that I fictitiously wrote and was convinced and telling me that it was real. And it was this really sort of overwhelming experience of feeling like my artwork had like run away from me and that it had a life of its own. And I mean, the point of the work was to question history and to question where we get our information from and who is telling us our history back to us, right? Like, who's the author of this history and this narrative. So it really proved my point, I guess, that a lot of us don't do any follow-up research to understand where our information is coming from. But it was a little scary that this person was so adamant that even after a long conversation, they were still convinced that the story that I had written was real. So that was like a terrifyingly awesome reaction to my work, where someone had actually run with it so far that I couldn't convince them that I had written the story, and they believed that it was real. So that was wild. In general, though, since I'm making work that's a little bit more fantastical and less rooted in history, now with this current work, I'm thinking a lot about more imaginative and fantastical spaces, a fabricated reality. And so I guess what I hope people take away from the work is that I want it to be sort of a combination of escapism and maybe reorientation. So the idea that you can get lost in the image and experience something new and fantastic, something that a landscape that feels almost unbelievable, beyond our natural world, or maybe even I've had people talk a lot about really fantastical, beautiful experiences that they've had in nature, that the images remind them of, that I love that kind of recalling of really emotionally moving experiences in a naturally beautiful space. But otherwise, I think these works often look otherworldly and maybe make the viewer think of maybe a distant future or a distant past or a totally other world. And I like that idea of this sort of journey that you can go on, experiencing the work, having this sort of like little trip to another fantastical place. And I hope that after viewing the work and having this little excursion, you can come back to this plane of existence and hopefully see the current world that we live in a new light. And especially since this work is referencing a landfill and talking a little bit about detritus and our trash and the way the Earth's surface is changing, I do want the work to sort of make you think about the ever-changing surface of our Earth and the idea of the Anthropocene, which is how humans are changing the surface of the Earth, mostly through our, plastics and things that will never go away. So the pieces themselves actually have the structures, the sculptures that the paintings are referencing have other elements like aluminum foil and some other man-made components that are kind of within the glass. And so yeah, thinking a lot about the Anthropocene and this changing surface of the Earth in relationship to our current experiences and future experiences within landscape.